Good afternoon, everybody in internet land and here at the New Orleans Jazz Museum. My name is David Cunion. I am the curator of the New Orleans Jazz Museum. Glad everybody can be here. I am tickled pink and totally thrilled to have these two great scholars and folks on stage. This is Michael Allen Zell, author, bibliophile, and general man about town, as they say. And this is Kalamu Ya Salaam, author of The Walkin' Blues that we'll be talking about today. Author, poet, cultural activist. All right, we could go on, but and they're going to talk about the book and assorted other things. Please enjoy this. Round of applause, please.
You know what? I'm going to add one thing for me. How about that? Oh. I'm going to add publisher because I had the honor of not only publishing this book but learning and being very jealous, sir, of your students along the way, because I've met at every event. This is a range of New Orleanians who are writers, but also people doing things around town, because it's instilling a certain mindset that is like that rigorous, very exact kind of thing. And I think I know for me, there are people I didn't realize that the roots of that tree that you've expanded, that's turned into all these limbs, that runs deep. So there we go.
It runs through two individuals in particular. One is Danny Barker. And Danny influenced and directly touched so many of the New Orleans musicians and cultural workers in the city that just to run off a list of the names of them, it's almost impossible to do. But in working with Danny, and I was introduced to Danny by Tom Dent, and in working with Danny, I learned something. I'm on a program right now. Talk to you later.
There's some food for you.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
In working with Danny, I learned so much about things I didn't know. And Danny was, what I remember about Danny Barker, among many things, one of the things I remember is that he had decided early in his life to move up to New York, and he was telling me about some of the things. And then he got the invitation to move back down to New Orleans. And when he came back to New Orleans, the first, I guess how would you describe, David, what this place is? Archives, but it's more than just archives.
When Danny comes back, it's really a living archive.
Yeah.
Not only because the guys who invented jazz are still around.
Right. And so with Danny, through Danny, I was introduced, as you were pointing out, this was a living archives. And I got to meet so many people that I would never have even thought about. But Danny was also one of the people who influenced and encouraged me to be a writer. People don't know that Danny wrote a lot. He did a lot of writing. And as you got to know Danny, if you would get to know him, first you'd see him on the street and what have you. Then you'd get invited to his house and sitting in his front room And then, if he so desired, you'd get to meet him in his kitchen when he was living on Sear Street. And then there was another level, because in the back room, he kept a lot of memorabilia. And I remember Danny, one of the times we'd been talking in the kitchen and Daddy said, "I want to show you something." And he'd get up and I'd follow him into that back room.
Hmm.
And in the back room, he had, I don't know what you would call it, but it was set up so that he kept a lot of stuff. And I'm walking back and I'm looking around. And I'm both ignorant and curious, you know, because about what he's showing me. And I look at this shelf and he's got all kinds of things on it, you know, instruments and what have you. And there were a pair of shoes sitting on the shelf there. I said, "What's this, Danny?" He said, "Oh, that's Bojangles." I said, "Bojangles?" He said, "Yeah, that's Bojangles shoes." Just like, I mean, it was
Yeah.
like you and I would say, well, you know, that's the outside, the sky is blue. That's the way.
Can I interrupt you and ask you?
Yeah.
Is this when you're back in New Orleans from the military?
Yeah.
We're like in 69, 70 maybe? Are you doing NOMMO at this point?
No, that conversation was in the, let's see, I was in the Army. This would have been in the early 70s, yeah.
Okay. So you'd already, literary-wise,
Yeah.
NOMMO was going and maybe
And
some
Combo
travelers.
was gone and what have you,
Yeah. But that's essential, though, Danny Barker. Yeah.
the Danny Barker was, and so I would hang out a lot with Danny. When Danny would perform on the riverboats and what have you, I would go with him and so forth and so on. And Danny, but I will never forget, oh, that's Bojangles. I mean, because think about it. We seldom meet people from not an earlier era, but one of the first eras of New Orleans modern culture post the Civil War. And Danny knew those people, walked with those people, talked with those people. And so, I mean, it's hard to even explain how much it meant, but instantly for me, what it did was affirm that what I call a griot tradition in New Orleans is not just some book learning or something. I mean, can you imagine you're talking to somebody that knew Bojangles, had Bojangles shoes, say, "Oh, that's Bojangles." Just like it was, I said, "Well, that's David Cunha. You know, he worked over there at the Jazz Museum."
You know what? That's leading me to a curiosity.
Yeah.
So in Walkin' Blues, is Robert Johnson, as you're picturing him, is he an unintentional griot? Because he's got a lot of wisdom, or at least the things that he considers.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
About the griot tradition. But the griot tradition is a tradition about what I would call a conscious cultural worker. Someone who had become conscious of their status and importance as a cultural worker.
Mhm.
I mean, New Orleans is full of cultural workers, but they're not necessarily fully conscious of that statue.
Mhm.
Danny was conscious of it, at least in the latter part of his life. He became conscious of it. And these people do not advertise themselves. They don't, there's no plaque on their house. They don't have a sign on their chest or nothing like that.
Mm.
And they, quote unquote, they just look like ordinary people walking up and down the street. But if you got to know them, you really, I mean, it's really something. And New Orleans is full of those kind of people.
Mhm.
In other places, they might have, what's his name, the trumpet player from Davenport, Bix Beiderbecke. You know, you go to his hometown, there might be one or two, but you come to New Orleans, and like we used to say, at the bus stop, you sit down and you talk to somebody, and you never know who you're talking to.
Mhm.
And they could tell you more about the culture than any book could, because within the people is the essence of the culture, but a lot of it has not been written down.
Mhm.
And that's part of the reason I decided to become a writer. And I'm looping this back to Danny Barker, because Danny Barker, well, Tom Dent introduced me to Danny Barker, and from there, I became friends with Danny Barker. And Tom Dent was my immediate inspiration, mentor, and what have you. But the point I'm making is that in this city, we have the opportunity, all of us have the opportunity to meet people and talk to people who are very important cultural workers. And if you're from someplace else, you don't have that opportunity. If you're from a place as important as San Francisco, New York City, Washington, D.C., even Los Angeles. I say even Los Angeles because there's a whole nother thing there with Hollywood. But those people, the people who are the primary sources, are removed from everyday people. Here in New Orleans, you can walk down the street and sit at the bus stop or stand at the bus stop or lean on one of the trash cans or what have you. When you get to my age, you're leaning, you ain't, you know. But, and the people that come by, just quote unquote, the nameless people, the people who don't have a name, as I say, who don't have a sign or whatever, who are not chauffeured around, they can teach you so much. And you can't get that in other places.
Mhm.
And not to mention, I was saying Bix Beiderbecke from Davenport. I mean, what a waste, Davenport. But anyway.
Well, you know, the size of the city too. You know, we're
Yeah.
not compared to New York. We're a small enough city that we're just going to mix a little
Yeah,
bit more, right?
Call it a walking city.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
New Orleans, nowadays, not so much, but New Orleans used to be a walking city. This is before the East was developed.
Hmm.
And so you could literally, well, almost all the buses ended up on Canal Street.
Streetcars back in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you were catching, it didn't matter what bus you caught, whether you were going uptown or downtown, it would end up on Canal Street. And it's not so much the case nowadays,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But New Orleans used to be a walking city. So if you can imagine, we didn't have the transportation. You didn't have as many vehicles, but you had a bus system that all the buses end up on Canal Street. And so when I was coming up, we would know you get on the bus, 7 cents, and then you pay the extra 3 cents to get the transfer because you could use that transfer all day long.
Mm.
They had the times on what you call the receipts, the bus thing. They would have time, but if you knew the city, you could go all day on one transfer. You know, back and forth, and so that included uptown and downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And Canal Street was the thing. And so we would, I'm from the lower Ninth Ward, so we would go the Galvez bus going one way, and then we'd come back home on St. Claude. And, you know, you'd walk when you got downtown, but
Mm-hmm.
that aspect of the city, I think it's not quote unquote unknown, but it's the aspect of the city that is not formally usually talked about. That not only, as you say, the size of the city, but the aspect of the city that Canal Street between Claiborne and the river was the connecting spot. And it didn't matter what part of the city you lived in, you could always get there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you knew, like we were, some of the youngsters, all day long you could negotiate. So you leave in the morning, and with that, the transfers, they had a time on it. So you said it would have one, I forget what it was it about an hour or whatever. But you know, the top of your transfer would be say 1 o'clock, and then 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
And you could give up that portion of the transfer to the bus driver, and you tear it off to give a portion of the ticket that you ride on, and that could be all day if you knew what you're doing.
You know, something that, so my antenna went up automatically when you mentioned New Orleans being a walking city,
Yeah.
because there might be some people that say, well, so we know Kalamu Ya Salaam's traveled a little bit around the world, but
Yeah.
what's he know about Mississippi? So I learned today about the Danny Barker connection. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. I also learned along the way for different book events something else that I didn't know, which was a lot of for those of you here, a lot of the background, even though this is 1930s Mississippi, people might not know that the Black Arts movement that you're involved in was not limited to New Orleans.
No.
You spent a lot of time in Mississippi as well. Would you speak on that a little bit?
Well, what had happened was I came back. I was in the city. I grew up here in New Orleans. And in '64, I graduated from St. Augustine High School and was presented the opportunity to go to college at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. So I went up there. It was on a trimester system, and I lasted 2 semesters. So, you know, that's all I could do. I mean, I'm not intelligent. I'm not super intelligent. And at that time, I was not fully aware of who I was. So I wasn't prepared, fully prepared, even though I'd been sent to St. Aug for high school. Academically, I could deal with it, but I wasn't prepared culturally on an individual basis for that. Although Carlton provided me with so much, like, for instance, while I was there, this is 64, 65, I get to see Ravi Shankar live, playing the sitar. That would not have been available to me had I just stayed in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
When I was up there, I saw that was my first time seeing live Art Blakey. And in the band, he had Freddie Hubbard was playing trumpet in the band. And I got to meet those cats. And then while I was there, I'm answering your question, but I'm taking a long way around. While I was there, right before I left Carlton, we took a drive down to Fisk in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I drove down there, and I got to meet and converse with a number of people. Nikki Giovanni was at Fisk at that time. I didn't really know her nor really meet with her, but I did hook up with John Oliver Killens, and that was a major thing for me. And if we don't know who John Oliver Killens was, he was that generation that preceded what's commonly called the Black Arts Movement of writers and cultural workers. He knew a lot of people, and he really opened my eyes to a lot of things. So I got to meet John Oliver Killens, and then no sooner I got back from Fisk, the little trip we took at the end of the second, we was doing the second semester at Carleton. When I got back to Carleton, I immediately came back to New Orleans. And I guess that's where, if I would place anything where the beginnings of my desire to see the world and to travel the world, or as Sun Ra would say, to travel the spaceways, rather than just be here. In fact, we heard, y'all ain't had no life if y'all had never experienced Sun Ra on a steamboat on the Mississippi. Yes, indeed, that's a whole nother story, but I won't get into it.
But the thing is, if I can step in,
Yeah.
Even as you're speaking about things that aren't about the book,
Yeah.
these are all things that are about the book, right?
Right.
Because to me, it's, and you might have even commented on this previously, is that in a book of fiction, there may be more of you in this than any of your nonfiction works, right? You can confirm or deny neither.
In a sense, there is.
Yeah.
Because when you're writing fiction, you're using your imagination. And your imagination, those ideas and feelings come from somewhere. And in later years, I learned to draw on other people, but when you're starting out, you're drawing on your own experiences, your own life. I mean, I don't know how many of you in the audience, but I'm almost sure if you write something, the first times you're writing stuff, you're drawing on your life experiences, whatever they may be, in terms of the writing. So I get back to New Orleans from Carleton. I dropped out of school, Carleton College, get back to New Orleans. And my parents, and I was blessed to have beautiful parents, they would not allow me just to sit there and do nothing, or just to go work on the riverfront or something like that. And my father had been in World War II, in the Korean conflict. As a writer, I learned to write. My mother was a third grade school teacher, and my father was a laboratory technician at the VA hospital. But from him, he passed to me a Royal typewriter, one of those little Royals that a lot of the soldiers had, because it was like a box. It was smaller than this speaker here, and box, the Royal typewriter. And you'd put, and so looking back on it now, I can see, but at the time I didn't realize that was my beginnings as a writer. And I got it, I know where I got it. I got it from my father, and then my mother, for seventh, no, at the end of seventh, eighth, ninth, at the end of ninth grade, she sent me to study with one of her colleagues who was teaching typing. So I learned to touch type before I got to high school. And so all of these things helped me as a writer. I know how to touch type on a typewriter. My father had given me a typewriter. And these things, I've never really thought about it that much until recently. But for our children, it means a lot that when we as parents pass on to them instruments of literacy. And in New Orleans, the instrument of literacy of choice was not something that was textual, it was musical. And so a lot of New Orleans musicians, they got it, like we used to say, you got it from your mama, huh? Or your daddy gave you that. And we don't even realize how much parents have influenced what happens with young people. So when I got back to New Orleans, I told you it's taking a long way around. But when I get back, I learned, my parents decided to make me to do things, and I ended up going to the Army. And I got to the Army because I went down to where the main post office is. Right next to it was the federal building. Literally, it was part of it might still be, I don't know, I haven't been there in a long time. But at that time, you had to sign up for the draft if you made 18 as a youngster. So I never will forget, here I am. If you're not in college, you had to sign up for you had to sign up for the draft, but if you're not in college, you don't get an automatic deferment. And at that time, they were actually, quote unquote, arresting people and making them that didn't register, because with Vietnam and all that stuff. So I went down there, and I get there, and as this elderly white woman at the federal building, and I tell her I'm coming here to sign up for the draft, and she asked me, when is your birthday? I told her what my birthday was. Well, when did you say your birthday was? I told her. You breaking the law. Because I had made 18, but I hadn't signed up for the draft.
Mm.
You come back here tomorrow, and we're going to deal with you. So I asked the audience, what do you think I did when she said, you come back here tomorrow and we're going to deal with you? This is a white woman talking to a Negro boy who's made 18 but has not signed up for the draft. What do you think I did? Ran? Huh?
I think you didn't go back.
I did not go back there the next day. I told my mother what had happened. And so what I did was I went on Canal, used to be not far from here, Canal and the river. Because what was there? That was where the custom house used to be. And you signed up for the Army or for the military. And so that's what I did, because there wasn't many choices for people. What's happening?
How you doing?
I'm hanging in there. I'm just trying to tell some lies right quick.
I love hearing.
I'm going to introduce this young man in a minute, because he's one of the, well, I'll get to that. I'm going to get to that part. But anyway, I go down there, and I literally tell the officer who was inducting people, or signing people, not inducting, but signing people up. I literally told him, I want to sign up to go anywhere but Vietnam. That's what I told him, man. I want to sign up to go anywhere but Vietnam. You know, I'm 1 year out of high school. You know, and he says, son, I can't promise you that. I mean, he was being very courteous. That was not the norm for a white man talking to a young Negro boy at the time, but he was being very courteous to me. He said, son, I can't promise you that. And I'm smart ass, you know, so I say, well, I know y'all got something, some job y'all got that's not in Vietnam. You know, I'm going to sign up for the Army, but I don't want to go to Vietnam. And the man told me, he said, yes, we do have some jobs, but you have to pass a test to take one of those. I said, give me the test. And they gave me a test, and smart ass me ends up in my MOS, the job designation I eventually had after I did the basic training and what have you. I was, my MOS was Nike Hercules nuclear missile repair. And so I was designated and sent to El Paso, Texas, where I was trained to be, to repair the Nike Hercules nuclear missile. And that led to me going to, this is a long way around to answer your question, but that led to me going to, on a ship to South Korea. In fact, the ship my trip to South Korea, we left from San Francisco. I was on the last ship that the Army used to send soldiers to South Korea. After me, after that particular trip, all of the tankers the ships were being they were used to send troops to Vietnam.
Vietnam.
And so I was on the last one.
Hmm.
And I got to South Korea, and I'm going real fast right now because I realize I've been talking a whole bunch. But I got there. We got there, arrived early in the morning, and we had to muster out standing on the deck of a ship. And you know, the East at that time was called the land of the rising sun after the Japanese and what have you. And I'm literally standing on the deck with what do you call those, the bags we used to have, the duffel bag, with a duffel bag, right. I'm standing there on the deck of the ship with a duffel bag, and the sun is coming up. It was that early in the morning. We were standing before and I was put on a train. We landed in Busan, South Korea, which is at the bottom. And I'm assigned to a base that's 50 miles from the DMZ at the top of. And so I'm on the 6 o'clock in the morning. The officer put a tag on us, each of us. When I say tag, literally to the button on our jacket, they tied a tag and they said, you get off there. And I didn't know nothing, but you just following the orders. And so, David, what do? I mean, you're standing there. They gave you you got all that you can carry in your duffel bag. That's all you know. And you arrived in South Korea, never been outside the country before. Here you are, you're arriving in South Korea. 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun comes up, and they tell you, all right, get off the ship and go over there to a train. And so I'm being obedient, and I'll go over to where the train is, and the train looks like, y'all see these movies where they have Jesse James driving. That's what that train looked like. It was one of those old-ass trains. And I get on the train like I'm told to do. And at that point, that was, as far as the English speaking goes, that was the end of it. They put me on that train. Here I am, 18-year-old, about 18 years old soldier. And they put us all on the train, and you got this tag on you. Mm. And somebody comes through the train where we sitting and said, let me see your tag, and show you show the man your tag. Say, well, you just sit here, we'll tell you when to get off. Since I'm going north, I'm one of the last people to get off. And it's that night when we finally get to where I'm supposed to, and they tell me to get off. And I get off the train, and I said, what I'm supposed to. He said, man, get off. You just wait there. Somebody will come and get you. And I get off the train, and there's this Korean guy, South Korean, elderly man, and he said, Yogi. I said, Yogi, what? And he pointing. And so I follow where he pointing. And I'm at a depot. I got off. And there's nobody there. And so I just stand there. He said, Yogi, I don't know nothing. I'm standing there. And about 15, 20 minutes later, a 3/4 pull up. 3/4, the trucks pull up. And a soldier say, hop in. Hop in. What is he talking about? Hop in. And what he meant was for me to climb in the back of the truck. And so I climbed in the back of the truck. And that was my introduction to South Korea. And they drive, I forget what town it was we were in, but then they drive, you got in the truck and they drive you a little bit inland, like I say, 50 miles from the DMZ. And I'll skip that whole part to get to your question. But I spent a year in South Korea. That was the year that Luau Sindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and then won the NBA. And so I spent, the career was a beautiful education for me. Now, again, I'm skipping now. And so when I get out of the Army, 3 years later, Korea and Fort Bliss and El Paso, Texas and everything, when I get out of the Army, I'm discharged. And I should pick it up. I'm in Fort Bliss, and by now, Kalamu has become a musician. I'm playing drums, right? And I'm discharged, but right before I'm discharged, the band I was in came in first in a contest that we had that was at a motel. And so that band was our band was won a gig that we were gonna have a monthly gig at this hotel. When I'm released from the Army, discharged from the Army, I say, I'm going home. The guy said, no, don't go, man. Don't do it. Stay here, because if you go home, you're not going to come back. I said, man, don't even, I don't even want to hear it. Don't want to hear it. Because, I'm going to tell you why I said, because I'm going to leave my drums here, and y'all know what I think about my drums. When we would do gigs, I'm the drummer. You know, people would come and want to help you and everything, pack up and all that. No, don't touch them. Don't touch my drums. That's my drums. I'll take care of it. I'd be the last one to, and everything, but I'm still going to take care of it. Wouldn't you know it, I got to New Orleans and I'm sitting around closest as you and I are right now. I'm closer than that to Zigaboo playing drums at Shreveport, Shrewsbury. In Shrewsbury, they had a club out there. And so can you imagine, here I am, I done got out the Army now, but I hear these drums and and that was like a magnet. That was it. I never went back to El Paso, Texas, never saw my drums again. You know, because I was so transfixed by the musicians here in New Orleans. And I blame it on the New Orleans musicians, Zigaboo amongst them, that got me to stay in New Orleans, because otherwise I would have been right back there
Mm.
in El Paso with my drums and everything else like that, my buddies. And in fact, couple of the cats were from New Orleans. Chuck Sala, who became one of them. Yeah, well, Chuck was in at the same time, but I would have been right back there at Fort Bliss, Texas.
Hmm.
But I came here, and the New Orleans musicians, hearing that New Orleans music, and getting to know the musicians, and so that was the genesis of why Kalamu is who he is. Part of it had to do with that Royal typewriter. That was part of being a writer. My mother was a school teacher, and my dad had done time in the Army, so that's why I went to the Army and so forth.
Mm.
But I'm here, so that's background. So you can ask me any question you want to ask.
You know what I want to ask you. So we're at the Jazz Museum.
Mm-hmm.
On one of the other floors, they have some really unique handmade instruments.
Yeah.
There's a chapter in Walkin' Blues specifically on handmade instruments, but there's one instrument I know they don't have here.
Dillybo.
Would you talk about that a little bit? Because you got to have a house in the place to play the house, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So y'all heard of Rock in the House, right? Yeah. That's not a metaphor. That came from reality. What they used to do, what they did was, they had the side of these houses were the wooden sides of the houses, and they nail them, and then they tie a wire between the nails on the side of the house, and they literally would pluck the wires. And when they plucked the wires, when they got to really doing it, that's what Rock in the House was about. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I know you. So Rock in the House was a real thing. Was a real thing, and so in Walkin' Blues, I'm talking about a lot of stuff that people don't even realize those were, that was reality. That house. So Bo Diddley, and they were called Diddley Bows, and that's where Bo Diddley got his name. Yeah, you got another question? I can see it.
I mean, you see it in my. I got 1,000 questions. One thing I want to make sure that we get to, because like everything else, everything that even Danny Barker, all this that's not about the book, it all ends up in there, right? Some form or fashion. Yeah. I learned this morning about the passing of Dr. Jerry Ward.
Yeah. For
those who don't know, Dr. Ward, I think before he retired, taught at Dillard, but he taught in Mississippi, was the foremost U.S. expert on Richard Wright. Pretty much, I would say most African-American literature anthologies, if he didn't edit, he somehow seemed to be involved. Wrote poetry. Interestingly, he was one of the co-founders with Tom Dent and was it Charles Roll?
Charles Rowell.
Rowell,
yeah.
of a journal called Kalamu.
Right.
We happen to have the first issue here, matter of fact.
Yeah.
And Baba Kalamu has a poem in here. Would you speak a little bit about Dr. Ward? Or if you'd like to read the poem, it's on page 10, I think.
Yeah, you have recent memories of this stuff.
I read it this morning to myself.
It's called Inner Sister Blues. This is number 2, The Shelter. This was from a long poem. And I had to take my glasses off.
And you want to catch, this has not been heard for a minute, so yeah.
Inner Sister Blues, The Shelter, number 2. She looked from the street, up, down into the slanting sunlit sidewalks she looked, spying for the cool-eyed walk of Billy Boy Blue. No queen, she sat on concrete stair stumps, waiting on her black hunches for Billy Boy Blue. And maybe it was not really him she missed so much, so much, so much. As was it the rent money gone for a new big hat, or the baby's milk stolen and replaced by thick blue marijuana smoke beclouding the eyes of Billy Boy Blue. She looked over much. The evening shadows grew long as the dogs pissed their contempt of ghetto lives onto public telephone poles. She looked and looked and looked some more. And finally, Billy Boy Blue comes sauntering home, a glint in his eye and his cap on rightly wrong, cocked and kicked back. What's the matter, baby? I knows it be hard and cold. You looks like you need the warmth of my arms to shelter you from the storm. She looked, she looked, and she looked.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I do have one question on that.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious for what you say on Dr. Ward. That's one thing I love. One of my favorite things, everybody around the world who's catching this live now and in the future, I love when a poet, because I think it's safe to say your literary output is majority poetry. I think that's accurate.
No,
right?
it's not accurate.
That's not accurate?
It's not accurate.
No?
The majority of what I write, I would say it's prose, what they would call designated as prose.
Okay.
Majority of what I first published was poetry.
Okay.
But I was writing everything. In fact, I used to, with the typewriter my father gave to me, I'd put a sheet of paper in the type, the whole roll thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd type, and when I got to the end of that page, it'd almost be falling out, and I'd grab it and flip it, turn it over, and on the back, and type. And I got to the point where I knew when I was nearing the end, and that's when I would stop.
That's where you stop.
That's when I would stop. And I got so good at it that I didn't even use envelopes to mail the stuff that I would write to people. I would take the page and fold it in thirds, and on the back I'd write the address and the
Yes.
return thing and
Yes.
put a stamp on it, so I wouldn't have to use an envelope.
Sure. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, well then I'm going to amend what I said.
All right.
But my general, like, sort of not point, but just as I was feeling that when you're reading that poem, is the flow of that, and what I love is Walkin' Blues is your first published novel.
Yes.
And I love that it doesn't read necessarily like some other novels, but some of that is, this is Robert Johnson walking across Mississippi,
Right.
and he's thinking about deep things, but he can't think about them on the level of someone that has this level of background, education, whatever. He's a regular guy with an irregular, exceptional talent, right? So
Well,
he's got to convey what he's talking, but you have that cadence in the sentences, and I love that.
Well, see, this is what I believe. I believe all human beings think. It's part of being human.
Hmm.
But most black people have not been taught to think. And most of us don't even think that black people can think. We recognize that black people can run, jump, play ball, and what have you. And so when we look on television, what do we see? We see entertainers and sports figures, right? We don't, black people are never present, not shouldn't say never, but in general are not presented on television as great thinkers. So who do we think of as great thinkers? We don't even think of quote unquote whites as great thinkers. We go back to the Greeks, right? Come on, y'all, don't be ashamed of the truth. That's what we taught in school. Who were the great thinkers? You know, there you go, Socrates, Aristotle. There you go. You understand what I'm saying? We have not thought of black people as great thinkers. But if I ask you who could shoot the ball, who could, you start thinking of black people in those terms. So, but we don't think that black people can think. Not because of black people, but because we were raised in the United States of America with that whole propaganda about all human beings think. All human beings think. And what I was trying to do was write our thoughts down. And I was blessed to have been gifted with the ability to write. Partly going back to what I was saying in the beginning, with my father having a royal typewriter, a portable typewriter in World War II, but also because my mother was a school teacher and what have you. And I learned to write early on, but I had not I dropped out of school the first year of college, so I had not been taught to write to use the vernacular by white folks. And I'm saying using the vernacular because I don't mean just white people. I mean by this education in the United States of America. So many black people have been, who are college educated, they were not my friends either, wasn't no friend of mine. And Tom Dent was the first one I met, first person I met who really was college educated, but Tom also had his problems, and his father was Albert Dent, who was the president of Dillard University. But Tom had his problems with education and so forth and so on. And when I say education, I'm talking about formal education. I do not mean understanding and intelligence and what have you. And so that's where, when you talk about Robert Johnson, I think Robert Johnson was one of those people who had a desire to know, to learn, and to do things with his mind, but did not have the formal education of literacy and writing. And many of us are brought up to believe that if you're not formally educated, then you're not intelligent. and that's far from the case. And so that's what I was trying to do in writing, and I'm writing the way our people talked and the way our people did things. And so that's what I did.
Yeah. So every time you speak at length, it prompts several more questions in my mind, and it's my honor and my pleasure to ask a few of them. I'm told that we are reached the end of our line for today, but we barely scratched the surface.
Well, I mean, I'm sure people
So-
out here got something they want to ask.
Yeah, they're just cutting us for the live thing.
Oh,
But yeah. Y'all want to hit any questions? Please.
Who would you consider among the 1960s and 70s, the black leaders in this country, who would you consider to be the intellectuals or more highly thought out people?
only one. I didn't get into this talking about my education, but the only one would be Malcolm X. And that was for a number of reasons, one of which is relatively unknown to people. When I was at Carleton College in 1965, when Malcolm was assassinated, one of the young people in school at Carleton College, she was going with a black guy who was in the audience when Malcolm was killed. He wrote a letter to her, a long letter describing what happened. She, of course, shared the letter with a group of us. And so I personally was a beneficiary of that. And Malcolm X became, I was doing a radio program. I didn't even get into this. But when I was at Carleton College, they had a radio station. And so I did. But a young lady from Little Rock, Arkansas, she was in the studio with me, the radio studio, when Malcolm X was assassinated. I had a program that night, Sunday nights, February 21st. That Sunday night, 65. And as it was coming up, I get there early for the radio program, but part of my job was to teletype. You know, you've seen these Hollywood movies with the teletype machine. Well, you had to tear the paper off and tear it into strips by the categories, and I had to prepare the teletype for who came on at 10 o'clock. And so I was in the radio studio preparing the teletype when the news came in of Malcolm's assassination. And I can remember ripping it off. And Linda she was crying. And so when you asked the question, who was it? It was Malcolm X that first grabbed me emotionally, I would say. And then intellectually, I started reading and following up more and more about Malcolm, which led me to Amilcar Cabral. And Cabral was the person who most influenced me as a writer. Amilcar Cabral was not a writer, but he was also assassinated in Guinea-Bissau. It's a long story. I won't get into all of that. But to answer your question, that's Malcolm X was the first leader who was inspiration to me. And mind you, I had been in '63 when the March on Washington happened. I had decided not to go to the March on Washington as part of the NAACP Youth Council, but I sat on the steps at Bethel on Galvez and Dumaine, I think it is. Galvez and Dumaine, yeah. I sat there on those steps, and I can remember thinking about what do I want to do. And at that point, I resigned from the NAACP. I said, I can't do it anymore, you know. But as I thought about it, so I didn't go to the March on Washington, but I came under the sway of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X led me to Amilcar Cabral, and from that's where. That's the short answer to your question. Yes, sir.
While you were talking, I decided to Google who were America's most interesting black leaders in the 1960s. It said Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, and James Merritt.
Yeah. Yeah. Malcolm was, I can't even explain it.
I read the book about him in college, and I was stunned by it. I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
I'd heard about it, but I didn't know much about it.
Malcolm was somebody that did not go through the normal educational system. He went, through the prisons and through prison and came out. And he was autodidact. He had really taught himself. And Malcolm was someone who was constantly growing. And although people know him many people know him as one-dimensional, he was somebody that was constantly growing. And I was blessed to come under him because I was constantly wanting to develop, moving on to the next thing, never satisfied with wherever I was at the moment. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir. Go on.
I'd just like to say to your audience and to you and to the commentators that, I hope y'all bring him back because his story is so long, man, and it's very interesting. And it dawned on me in recent years the effects that this man has had in my life, even before I knew who he was personally as a friend. As a kid, and I told him the story as a 10-year-old. My mother and I standing under a tree as a protest was going on, and last words to her that day to me was, "Don't ever forget this." But later I found out in life, Kalamu was a part of that, and this one particular scene that I have in my head, he was in the middle of it. And so, bringing that point, later in life, I got to work with him. You were doing poetry, we were doing a band, but he was doing music. It was poetry, but it was music, the word band.
Yeah, that's Jonathan Bloom, by the way, y'all.
I'm sorry. Yeah. And so, that part of my life I ran into. But even before that, as a teenager with my drum instructor, Uganda, Alfred Roberts.
That's right.
One of the first Kwanzaa celebrations here
Parkchester.
in the city was at their facility in the lower Ninth Ward. I was a kid. And Albert said, "Hey man, we're going to do this." And I said, "What?" "We're going to play drums." And he was like the godfather of the hand drum in New Orleans at that time. So it was my duty to go with him. And I'll never forget this. You know, and then I started hearing about Kwanzaa. This was the early 70s.
Right. Yeah, we did the first Kwanzaa in New Orleans. Yeah.
And, so that in itself, and then when he was with productions, with musical concerts and stuff, went to Atlanta with a New Orleans presentation. Other things, we did recording with Kid Jordan, did a lot of different things, and I got to know him not as one thing. When you ask him to define himself, I say, man, how can I define him? Because if you try to define him, then you're limited in what he's done. You know what I'm saying? Because
Jim Randalls.
Jim
Mm.
Randall. He was having a round table with young kids, teenagers, and I stepped in on it. I guess I don't know what was the order of the class, but he would give them a reading or something. They had to read something, or maybe. But then y'all went into an open discussion where
Yeah.
everybody had to give their point of view, and it was just a real great moment for me to see, because when you see young people, being an educator myself in schools, you know, it, it lends itself to that. We have hope and optimism to see people doing feedback, and to see him in the middle of the circle, you know, stimulating it, and uh, you know, it just brings all of some resolution for me, you know, in the world. So
And see what's
appreciate
happening,
that.
what Jonathan is doing now. This is the way we conducted our classes, that if you were in the class, you had to speak,
Yeah.
whoever you are. It didn't matter, you know, and so it taught people to speak up. It taught people to value their own experience. If you can imagine, just like this room here, we would not leave unless everybody spoke and talked about their experiences. And I didn't want you to give an answer I would have given, or want you to say what happened to you, what you were thinking, what you felt, and so forth and so on. And if you do that every time.
That's a valuable thing, because
Mm-hmm.
in so many instances, every generation brings something to the table. And in this generation, you know, we struggle to bring teachers, we struggle to bring people into the class, into academia, into schools,
Yeah.
because they're afraid. They don't know what to expect, or they have not engaged that. They have not have seen that other side that you're bringing out. That's there. It's not just what we get in media, just one point of view. And so you're breaking down some walls, and you
Yeah.
continue to break down some walls.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
I
true.
love you for that, man.
That's
Well,
true.
thank you much.
Keep up the work.
What do you think about what we're talking about?
Well, I found it very, very interesting, and I feel like I'm learning a whole lot that I knew nothing about before. So I've enjoyed it very much.
I want to learn from you. What do you got to say? Say something about give us a comment on.
I came because I was interested in the book, but hearing your story was far more interesting to me.
What was interesting about it?
Just your journey from the lower ninth ward through college and through Korea and back here in New Orleans.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm not trying to.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, ma'am. Say something.
Kind of like with my friend Bonnie, I thought we were going to hear more about the book, but the stories have been extremely interesting.
Yes.
I think the typewriter is, if I ever even saw that, like if I read about that or saw that in a movie, I'd say, oh, this is what's so brilliant, that this individual's life was changed by this simple thing. And I really, I mean, I just, that to me was one of the most moving part of the whole thing. It's just like, oh my God. And then you say, like, you were in high school and you learned to type. You must have been the only one in high school that could type. You know, it's just, you know, it just wasn't taught. And it's just like, and I do remember those, the portable typewriters.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just, like I say, just amazing. And I know it's your story. I'm looking from that from the outside, and like I say, it's just incredible.
Yes, sir.
You mean just comment in general?
Whatever you want to say.
Well, actually, I'm writing a book right now about the history of New Orleans and Louisiana. And I think y'all might be interested in one of the things I found just a few months ago. And I thought I knew Louisiana history pretty well. You know, the first big city in the United States was in the state of Louisiana. It wasn't New Orleans or Baton Rouge. It was a place
So y'all see how important it is to hear from each other, and that we have so much amongst ourselves that we are taught to overlook ourselves. But when we open up ourselves to each other, there's so much we can learn. You know, I mean, who knew about the mounds?
9 out of 10 people I run into don't know anything about it.
And if you,
Generally, it has to be someone who's really knowledgeable that's going to know about it.
yeah, but everybody in here,
Not saying
not,
y'all aren't knowledgeable, but I didn't know
No.
about it until
Yeah, I knew
thanks.
about
Yeah.
it for years, many years.
You've heard about it?
but so if we sit and talk to each other, we can learn from each other. But we can't learn from each other if we're not willing to open ourselves up to each other. If we look at somebody, see the prejudice of our eyes haven't been reared in this society. We look at somebody, and the first thing we do, whether we realize it or not, we think, I know who they are.
Hmm.
You understand what I'm saying? You walk down the street, you see, so I know that's so and so. That's the stereotype. Don't trust your eyes until you learn about who it is you're looking at.
You know, I haven't heard someone, at least I don't remember someone saying the prejudice of our eyes before. That's a really strong statement.
Yeah, I mean, because we've been taught to look at each other in a certain way. You know, and so we can move beyond it. We don't have to be limited by the way we were brought up. We can move beyond that. But in order to move beyond that, we got to be open ourselves up to each other. That don't mean being stupid now. Somebody coming at you with a handgun, you know,
Right.
that doesn't mean being stupid, but it does mean that we recognize that we are all human beings and we can learn from each other. You know, I mean, that's part of what my being in South Korea taught me. You know, learn from people. You know, each other. Anyway, I don't want.
No, this is great. I'm going to go back to one thing. This is what you're going to get from me. And you've heard this already a few times. Is even talking about learning from people, the sense of community, being in a place where you don't know anybody and you're stuck and you just have to, by, the kindness of strangers and your own will, you have to figure it out. All those things are in the book. I go back to everything that's not about the book. I was thinking, wow, that's a theme in the book. Oh, that's a metaphor for this and this. So I love it because these are all ways of getting, and it's scratching the surface also on your life.
Yeah,
And I love that as well. These are things we've had a pretty good number of events for Walkin' Blues, and also just in chatting. I learned some things tonight, sir, I did not know. So I love just the I'm getting a little patchwork here and there, and for that sake I love it.
Yeah, well,
I love it.
Walkin' Blues, the book, it says Walkin' Blues, a novel, Kalamu Ya Salaam. But what I want to say is, specifically in terms of Walkin' Blues, it would have been still on my computer somewhere if it wasn't for this gentleman here, who said to me one day, why don't you, I'm thinking about publishing some of the work you've done. And he didn't know about Walkin' Blues at the time you asked me.
That's right.
And I said, well, here, because I had a jaw full of shit, Here, look at this. And about I guess it was not even a month later,
Oh, definitely not a month. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely not a month.
he comes to me and said, well, we want to do something with this. you know. And believe me, that's what makes New Orleans music, New Orleans music. That it is not, this is not, even though we have major music schools here, Grunwald's, at one time Wehrlein's was a spot and so forth. And we've got joints here or clubs where people play music. They got that all over the United States. But what's different about here is you have some musicians who are what we call educated. And that's the life experiences. And there's a value to that. And they pass it on amongst each other. And since the city is built on music, we don't look down on musicians. We don't think of musicians as just as entertainers, which is the case in most of the United States, where a musician is just an entertainer. But here, a musician could be anybody, you know, and that's what we have. And so I think we can learn from each other. And it's very, very difficult to break out of the United States system, but we can do it. As human beings, we can actually learn from each other and respect each other, you know, and value each other. Be we male or female, black or white, or whatever, you know, we can learn from each other. And unfortunately, those of us who happen to be males assume that there's nothing to learn from women. You know, I mean, that's a general assumption we have.
Not in my house. My wife is teaching me stuff all the time.
But we live in a society that is shaped that way. And it infects all of us. Even the most progressive of us are backwards in that sense. And we were raised in a backward society. I would say ass backwards, really.
Yeah.
But so we can learn from each other. And it's hard to get beyond whom we are in order to learn all that we can be. It's hard to get beyond whom we are, whoever we are, to learn from each other about what we can be. And that's the thing, we just got to bear with each other and understand that we all have our weaknesses, you know, and we got to, as they say, stand together. Walk together, children, don't get weary. We just got to do this. And if we don't do it, we're going to end up being what we already are. And none of us want to be where we at. We all have dreams and ideas of being further than we are. Even if we don't express it, even if we never express it to another human being, we still have within us, a dissatisfaction with where we at. We want to be, we want to get beyond this. But we can't get beyond this if we are afraid to open ourselves up to each other.
That's true.
You know.
We got to clear the stage.
Oh,
But with that, you better join me. You better join me. You better join me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. Oh, thank you.
Huh?